who do not agree with the goal of bringing more people into the political process. In fact, they believe the very opposite. And they are working overtime to make it harder for people to vote, or harder for people to express their political views, especially for those people who might vote against them. Each Republican-controlled state may do it a little bit differently, but the goal is always the same. Make it easier for Republicans to win elections, make it harder for Democrats and others to win elections. And tonight, we'll be discussing the ways in which they do that. And remember, and here's an important point, you don't have to not deny everybody the right to vote to win an election. Want everybody to remember what happened in November of 2020. Biden won a number of states by a very small margin, and because of the electoral college system, it turns out that he acquired the electoral votes necessary to win. Not very different, by the way, than what Trump did 4 years earlier than that. And tonight we're going to be talking about Georgia. And in Georgia in January, there was a special election for 2 US Senate seats. Very, very hotly contested election. Democrats ended up winning by 2 points or less. 2 points or less. And if you had voter suppression, the kind of voter suppression that exists in Georgia right now, it is not for sure that those Democrats would have won that election, which would have meant that, by the way, Democrats would not control the United States Senate. So you don't have to wipe out everybody's ability to vote. That's not happening. All you got to do is cut back 5, 10, 15% of people who might vote Democratic or otherwise not vote Republican, and you can win elections. And that's what's going on in this country today. So let's get going with our panel, and it is a great panel, it really is. We're going to hear from Ari Berman, and Ari is a writer with Mother Jones, and Ari has, I think, been as effective as any writer in this country in giving us an overview about what has been going on all across the country, what the Republicans are doing, what their goals are, et cetera, et cetera. After Ari, we'll hear from Ensei Ufat from Georgia. And Ensei has been very active in the New Georgia Project, which has done an extraordinary job in registering people to vote in Georgia. And she will talk about what's going on in that state and why that's happening. Then we're going to turn to John Nichols, who is from the great state of Wisconsin. And John has been following the issue nationally, but also taking a hard look at his home state to make it clear to all of us, this is not just a Southern strategy. This is taking place in other states as well, including Wisconsin. And John will talk about that. And last, but certainly not least, is U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar. Amy has been working really hard on federal legislation in the Senate that will address many of the problems that we're going to talk about tonight. So let's begin with Ari. Ari, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Senator Sanders. And it's great to be on this esteemed panel with 3 of my other favorite people. My 7-year-old daughter was really excited. I was doing an event with someone who ran for president. And I said, I'm doing an event with 2 people who ran for president. And that made her even more excited. She said, and one of them's a girl too. So thank you, Amy, for doing that as well. I was lucky enough to travel with Senator Sanders to Selma, Alabama for the 50th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday March with John Lewis and President Obama and so many other esteemed people. And it was an extremely powerful moment in American history where we could recognize all of the progress that had been made. But at the same time, we are at risk of turning back into a pre-Voting Rights Act America, where white conservatives are disenfranchising communities of color all over again. We are witnessing the greatest effort to roll back voting rights and the greatest effort to roll back fair representation since the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. And this is the most serious threat to democracy since the Jim Crow era. We saw the highest turnout in 2020 in 120 years. And instead of making that the new normal, Republicans want to make sure it never happens again. And the unprecedented attempt to overturn the election, the unprecedented insurrection at the Capitol, has morphed into an effort to achieve the goals of the insurrection through other, more subtle means. 19 states have passed 33 new voter suppression laws this year. I have been covering voting rights for a decade. We have never seen this depth and breadth of efforts to roll back access to the ballot. Things like making it a crime for election officials to send out mail ballot applications, making it a crime to give voters food and water in line, banning mail ballot drop boxes, making it harder to vote by mail in all sorts of different ways, but also making it harder to vote in person, cutting early voting, reducing polling places, getting rid of election day registration, making it so that you can't vote with student IDs, all of these kind of things. And most disturbingly, there's an effort to actually overturn election results if all other voter suppression tactics fail. That is the most disturbing thing that is happening right now. And Stop the Steal conspiracy theorists are running for election positions all across the ballot, from poll watchers all the way up to secretaries of state to governors who certify elections. The same states that are passing extreme voter suppression laws are now passing extreme gerrymandered maps for the US House and the state legislatures to make sure that you cannot vote them out of office, no matter what the will of the voters are. And some of the numbers are just staggering here. In Ohio, Republicans would control 80% of US House seats, in a state that Donald Trump only won by 53% of the vote. In North Carolina, Republicans would control 78% of US House seats, in a state that Donald Trump won with only 49% of the vote. In Texas, Republicans would control 65% of House seats, in a state that Trump only won with 52% of the votes. They would control 75% of House seats in Wisconsin, where Biden won, and Republicans would control 64% of seats in Georgia, which Biden also won. That means that Republicans could pick up enough seats through extreme gerrymandering alone to take back the US House. And at the state level, one-party rule could be locked in for the entire decade, meaning that really extreme unpopular policies, like de facto bans on abortion or allowing you to carry a gun without a permit, could be passed with virtually no accountability. And this is bigger than just partisan politics. We are seeing huge demographic changes in places like Georgia and Texas. But instead of increasing representation for communities of color, we are actually seeing representation for white conservatives increase instead. And the first Black city council members, the first Latino county commissioners are being wiped out by the maps that are passing. And this has been a game of asymmetric warfare, where Republicans are passing these laws through simple majority party line votes. But it requires 60 votes to protect voting rights in the US Senate, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the filibuster has really warped notions of representative democracy. The last thing I'll say is that I believe we are in a 1965 moment for democracy, where there is no substitute for congressional action. There was no substitute for the Voting Rights Act in 1965. You couldn't out-organize or out-litigate poll taxes or literacy tests. And I believe we are in a similarly make or break moment for democracy today. And Congress and the president needs to show the same urgency now as they did back then. So thank you so much to Senator Sanders for convening this important discussion, for having me. And thank you so much to the other panelists for the important work they're doing.
Well, Ari, thank you very much for the work you're doing and for your presentation. Our next panelist is Nsé Ufo, who is the CEO of the New Georgia Project, which has registered over 500,000 voters in all of Georgia's 159 counties. Nsé trains and organizes local activists across the state and will speak to us about what's going on in Georgia. Nsé, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Senator Sanders. Good evening, everyone. As the Senator said, I'm Nsé Ufo, and I am coming to you from the great state of Georgia. I'm a truth teller. I don't assume that I'm going to get repeat invitations. And so my contribution here today is not to be alarmist, but to have a little real talk about what is at stake here. Wow, it is true that we've registered nearly 600,000 young people and people of color to vote all over the state of Georgia. But the truth of the matter is that we don't do this just because we want registered voters, right? America has not had a raise in 12 years. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. In our state of Georgia, the minimum wage is $5.15. You can't take care of yourself, let alone a family, on $5.15. And because we are a state with one party rule, we can't get a proper hearing on raising the minimum wage in our state of Georgia, and our legislators are not embarrassed by that. And the reason that they're able to do that is because they don't feel any accountability to their constituents, to the people of Georgia. And the reason they don't feel any accountability is because they have gerrymandered these maps, because they have suppressed votes so significantly that the will of the people is not always reflected in the results of our elections. And that, my friends, is a problem. When we're looking at Roe versus Wade on the chopping block before the end of the year, when we're looking at, in our state of Georgia, 2 new nuclear power plants that are being built, and there haven't been any new nuclear power plants built in the US in 30 years, and they're behind schedule and over budget. And we are witnessing a sort of crisis in American democracy. And I don't use those words lightly. The way that we participate in our elections, the way that we make decisions as a country, as a city, as counties and states about how we're going to spend our tax dollars, what our priorities are, how we are going to make sure that our citizens and our neighbors are safe, right? That we have access to high quality education, that people have access to affordable quality healthcare. We do that through our elections. We do that through electing champions, people who will go to Washington, D.C. and go to your state capitals and do the people's work. But if we cannot trust that, again, the will of the people is reflected in the results of our elections, that's going to be a problem. We had historic levels of participation in Georgia's elections in 2020. Georgia is going to be the first state in the Deep South with the white minority. There won't be any race that's a majority in Georgia, that it will be a plurality and an opportunity for us to really build the Georgia of our dreams. And some of us are terribly excited about that future. And some of us are terrified. And the ones that are terrified are currently in power in our state legislature. And despite the fact that you cannot fight the future, they have taken it upon themselves to pass a bill called Senate Bill 202. And Senate Bill 202 is designed to make it more difficult for Georgians to participate in our elections. It is a trash bill. There are 50 changes to Georgia's elections that are reflected in Senate Bill 202. It creates 5 new voting crimes. It criminalizes handing out water and pizza to voters in line. It criminalizes receiving water if you're standing in line as a voter. There's the selfie bill. Gen Z, it's a direct attack on young voters, that if you are photographed with your absentee ballot, that is a misdemeanor that you can be charged for. They've created an anonymous tip hotline, and the secretary and the attorney general will investigate in 3 days. They've created a mass challenge provision. So anybody in Georgia can challenge an unlimited number of voters and ask that they be removed from the voter rolls. And those Georgians have 10 days to respond. They are terrified. If anyone has ever had a colleague or a coworker that was about to get fired, and you saw them starting to behave really badly, or if you had a partner and then you guys were about to break up and like started behaving really badly, that is what we're watching with this current version of the Republican Party. We are looking at the never Trumpers and the Trump 2024 folks who don't agree on anything, but they are unified in making it more difficult for Americans to vote, for Americans to participate in our elections, and they must be stopped. If you care about the minimum wage, if you care about reproductive health, if you care about access to healthcare, if you care about climate change, all of these things are impacted by who we elect to set policy, to set laws. And if they break the machinery of our democracy, we are in trouble. And it's not just vulnerable populations, and it's not just the Deep South, right? We are all going to be impacted by it. And so we must call for the end of the filibuster and passing the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This must happen soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, John. Nsé made the point, this is not just the Southern issue, it's a national issue. What's going on in Wisconsin? Whoop. You're on mute, John.
I'm not now.
No, you're not. I'm sure what you said before was brilliant.
Well, I did my whole talk in
Say it again.
I did my whole talk in 30 seconds, and now I'm done. But no, it's before we went on, I suggested to Nsé that my whole life has been spent in Wisconsin saying we shouldn't do this thing because if we did, we'd end up being like Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama. And it's an old school upper Midwesternism. But the truth of the matter is that Wisconsin right now is working as hard as it can to end up being as bad or worse than many of the states that we used to sort of lord ourselves over. And I really want to emphasize this. I think that Amy Klobuchar will understand that upper Midwest sense of superiority is really being eaten away by the realities of what's happening. So let me first off start by saying thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on with Nsé, who's such a brilliant organizer and just coming out of incredible election results last night in Georgia, where a Democratic socialist was elected mayor of one of the largest cities in the state, something that shows just what can happen in Georgia and what progress is occurring there. It's a city, by the way, that's, I believe, a bigger population than Burlington, Vermont. So now Georgia is competing on big city Democratic socialists. Ari Berman, whose work has been just transformational in this debate, and a friend and a comrade for a very long time. His book on Give Us the Ballot was just, it's one of the most important books that's been written on any subject, and I'm so honored to be with him. Amy Klobuchar, who brought Huber back to presidential politics, and who I loved covering up 2 years ago up in Vermont, and Bernie Sanders, who promised us a political revolution. And so I'm glad to be with all of you, here to talk for a couple of minutes about Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a classic battleground state, but historically it was a state where Democrats and Republicans agreed that they would fight their fights out based on their ideas and based on the quality of their candidates. Up to 20 years ago in Wisconsin, it was the easiest place to vote in the United States. You could literally show up with just your electric bill or even with somebody who would vet that you lived in the neighborhood, and you could cast your ballot. There were almost no barriers to voting. We had the highest turnout. We competed with Minnesota, sometimes beat them, sometimes lost, but held our own as a state which really embraced democracy. But it really is a battleground state. So in of the last 6 presidential elections in Wisconsin, 4 of them were decided by under 25,000 votes. I want to emphasize that. The last 6 presidential elections, 4 of them decided by under 25,000 votes. Our 2018 gubernatorial election in Wisconsin decided by under 30,000 votes. Our attorney general election in Wisconsin in 2018 decided by under roughly 22,000 votes. And so we have close elections. Now, when it's a high turnout election in Wisconsin, those close elections usually tip very narrowly to the Democrats. And so over the last decade or so, Republicans in Wisconsin have used their position in the state legislature to make it harder for Democratic voters to cast their ballots. It's as simple as that. It's not a complicated reality, but it has occurred on three levels that I will emphasize. First off, there is classic voter suppression. And this classic voter suppression, which Ari and Ense both understand very, very well, has focused on things like voter ID laws. And remember, Wisconsin, a place where you could just walk in and vote, same day registration, easiest place to vote around. Suddenly now you have to have a state issued and state approved voter ID. That made it more complicated. Attacks on early voting, attacks on the window for voting, so that it used to be very extended. Now it's become much narrower. Incredible pressure as regards how to do absentee ballots. Now we've made it easier to do it, but now we have all of this challenging of it in the courts, and it's become, a whole host of the sort of package of voter suppression moves. That's number one. Number two, gerrymandering. Wisconsin has the most radical gerrymandering in the United States. It was done in 2011 by Scott Walker, the former governor, at the same time that he was attacking labor rights and assaulting the rights of unions in the state. And that gerrymandering has created a situation where in two recent cycles, 200,000 more people voted for Democrats to control the legislature than Republicans. And yet Republicans ended up with almost 2-to-1 control of the legislature. That gerrymandering, which would have ended in this current cycle because a Democratic governor was elected, and usually the legislature, the Democrats would push for one thing, the Republicans push for another, you'd end up someplace in the middle. The legislature has rejected what the governor did. The governor vetoed, the governor had a proposal, the legislature rejected, then it vetoed. Now that went into the courts, and our hyper-partisan, supposedly nonpartisan, but actually hyper-partisan Supreme Court yesterday ruled 4-3 in a way that will allow them to protect the gerrymandered Republican maps. And so the reality is that we are very likely to be stuck with those Republican maps for another decade. We can go into that in some subtlety in a moment. And then the last thing I'll emphasize very quickly is election sabotage. Sabotage of election results and sabotage of the process. In Wisconsin, we are becoming ground zero for that. Senator Ron Johnson has proposed that the state legislature establish rules that would override the state board of elections and have the Republican-controlled legislature, without the governor's consultation, tell the state board of elections they can't set up the rules for elections, tell local county officials what they must do, and effectively create a situation where the Republican legislature could set the rules for elections in ways that would be particularly damaging to urban areas like Madison, Milwaukee, which have high Democratic turnout. I will close off simply by saying, why is this all happening? Because Donald Trump is running for president again. He's running in 2024. If he does, in fact, make that run, he will be the Republican nominee. And whether he wins or loses, in November of 2024, he will declare victory. And unlike in 2020, when you had state officials, some Republicans, many Democrats across the country, and judges who shut that down, in 2024, if things keep going the way they are in states like Wisconsin, they might vote against Donald Trump, but his allies would be in a position where they could game the system in ways that might yet deliver an election to Donald Trump. Not an election he won, but an election that was gamed and sabotaged by his allies.
All right, John, thank you very much. And on that cheerful note, let's go to Amy Klobuchar. Amy has been working really hard with people like Jeff Merkley and others on very strong voting rights legislation. Amy, what's going on in the Senate? What's going on in Congress?
Sure. Well, thank you, Bernie. And I know people on this Zoom know this, but Bernie was ahead of his time on this. I remember even into the election, we worked together on what we thought might happen, that we thought that Donald Trump wouldn't give up. Bernie was always predicting this, not just in the public, but behind closed doors, and that we were going to have to educate everyone on how the rules worked in the state and what was going to happen. And I want to thank Ari, John, and Say for your leadership and for showing us what's going on state by state, because I think it's important to remember it's not just Texas alone, right? It's going on. It's a coordinated effort across the country. For me, the moment that always sticks in my mind is walking across that broken glass at 4 a.m. With the two girls holding the mahogany box with the last of the electoral ballots, with Senator Blunt and Vice President Pence going over to the House, Speaker Pelosi there, House members there, to finish our job after that insurrection. And we did it. And then 2 weeks later, on this gloriously blue sky day, to me, it's all in Technicolor, everything from Lady Gaga's dress to Amanda Gorman's gold coat. And I thought, okay, leaders, George Bush is there, Barack Obama is there. This is a new dawn. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were inaugurated. And as you all remember, Bernie was sitting up there in those amazingly cool oversized mittens. So that's what I remember from that day. But what I didn't know and didn't quite, I guess Bernie probably would have predicted it, was that Donald Trump just never stopped. He kept claiming the lie that he had won the election, going around the country, rallying people behind this, going on social media, and then these voter suppression efforts, which have been so well described across the country. So this cries out for federal legislation. And this started with For the People and Jeff's leadership on that. He and I worked together on that. I chair the Rules Committee. And we actually got that through the Rules Committee after lengthy hearings, attacked by Ted Cruz. Then we went into the summer where we've negotiated this bill called the Freedom to Vote Act, which is very strong. And I think it's really important for everyone to know that it is based in the Constitution as clear as can be. Because the Founding Fathers, one thing they did actually in that Constitution, it says that Congress can make or alter federal election laws. That's in the Constitution. And it's never really been questioned. And that's one thing that's so amazing about the Freedom to Vote Act. What does it do getting at some of these problems that have been raised? I thought Nsei's story of Georgia was so strong because that what she went through, in addition to that, as she knows, no early voting during the runoff period in Georgia, no weekend voting during the runoff period in Georgia, all designed as one North Carolina law was described by a court years ago, designed discriminating with surgical precision because of the way Reverend Warnock won, the way John Ossoff won in that state, saying that you have to write your birth date on the outside of the inside ballot. So what does the federal law do? It says guarantees a right to early voting. It guarantees, it says 2 weeks before. Minnesota has 46 days, but it sets these minimum federal standards, right? It says same day registration. Every state, whether it's red, blue, or purple, has high voters, number of people voting when you have same day registration. It says you have to be able to vote by mail and does away with these unbelievably heinous requirements like they have in South Carolina right now, that you actually have to get a notary public to sign off to get an absentee ballot. There was actually someone with COVID in a hospital room that had to have someone notarize it, Bernie, through the window. And so those things are in place. Bans the partisan gerrymandering that we just all talked about, gets at the dark money with the Disclose Act and requires that be disclosed. Allows returning citizens to vote. It has so many provisions in there that reflect where the American people are and have support, actually, so many of them in red states, blue states, and the like. So through the summer, we negotiated that. Senator Manchin has signed off on that bill. It has the support of every single senator in the Democratic caucus. And I think now our next challenge is getting it through. That's why there are major discussions going on. We can get to this in the Q&A on restoring the Senate, the rules of the Senate to allow us to actually vote on a major piece of legislation like this. But as you know, the assault on democracy did not end with the assault on the Capitol. In many ways, it was the beginning of the assault on the democracy. And that's why this federal legislation is so important. And I'm proud to work with our caucus. And I want to mention, in addition to Jeff, that Reverend Warnock was in the group that worked on it, and Senator Padilla was in the group that worked on it, as well as Senator Schumer, who gathered us together, Kane and King and Tester and Manchin. So it was people from, John Tester is just incredible on this topic because he knows what they've done in Montana. And so it's people from all over the country that understand what's at stake here. So thanks a lot, Bernie.
Okay, Amy. And I think the first question goes right back to you, Amy. And
Okay.
Sam writes, how are we going to pass the voting rights bill through the Senate?
Sure. So one of the things that, I favor getting rid of the filibuster, and there's a bunch of people that favor that for a number of reasons. We have some members of our caucus that don't favor that, but the discussion doesn't end there, because when you look back through history, there have been 161 exceptions to the filibuster. Lovely number. There have been changes over time, numerous times, including former Minnesota Senator Walter Mondale, who changed the number of people needed to pass it. And we actually, Robert Byrd himself said that the Senate rules should be changed. I don't want to misquote him here. I'll get the exact quote for you on the depending on the circumstances. And so I think it's a good quote for us all to remember off of this call. And that is, he said, certain rules that were necessary must be changed to reflect changed circumstances. Well, do we have a changed circumstance? And so Senator Manchin has indicated an interest in getting rid of the motion to proceed and a standing filibuster. And so these discussions, and there's not much more time to talk, it's time for action. But these discussions are real, they're continuing, because I think everyone knows the stake. And I would also say people would not have sat in that room all summer negotiating this bill if they weren't serious about moving forward on protecting voting rights. And so, it is every single morning I wake up trying to figure out how we're going to get this done. But we have never given up, and we are reaching the point, and I end with this, with Bernie's question, we have to get this done because of what you just talked about with the partisan gerrymandering and the limits on time and the limits on the map. We don't have any time to waste.
Well, Amy, thanks very much, and thanks for your hard work in the Senate on this issue. Our next question comes from Kiernan, and he writes, with public confidence in democracy wavering, how should we engage disinterested citizens? How do we engage people? There was a poll that came out today, some of you may have seen it, from Harvard. Really just a whole lot of young people, polling young people who no longer believe that democracy is going to make it in America. So how do we engage people? And so you got thoughts?
I have thoughts.
All right, let's hear it.
I'll say this, the way that we train our organizers is that you have twice as many ears as you do mouths. And so we listen. People will tell you, excuse me, people will tell you what they care about. People will tell you their hopes, their fears, their ambitions for themselves, for their families, and for their communities. And so we work to connect the act of voting, the power of the vote, to the change that they told us that they want to see, right? Some people will tell you, I am I want to reduce state violence. I'm an education voter. I have children in elementary school, right? I have children with asthma, and I care about climate change. I live on Earth, and I want to continue to do so, right? And I care about climate change. Whatever it is, there are things that people care about. There are changes that people want to see, and we lead with that. We don't talk about the vote as if it's some magic bullet. It's a tool that's in our tool belt that we can use to build the country that our families deserve.
And that's incredibly well said. You're absolutely right. Voting is not some kind of abstract thing. You got to connect to where people are, what they want, what they need, and make the connection that democracy is a way to bring that about.
Hi, Bernie, I thought we liked that line, there's twice as many ears as there are mouths, to use with our fellow senators tomorrow.
If I can just jump in and add one more thought coming off what Ense said. Look, the answer to the question is govern. And this is the crisis of the filibuster. It is unimaginable that you're going to be able, that in this case, Democrats who are in charge because they control the White House and the House and Senate are going to be able to go to people in 2022 and say, yeah, we promised you labor law reform. We promised you policing reform. We promised you all of these other things, not just Build Back Better and that, but we promised you a lot of change. And we weren't able to do that because of a rule in the Senate. And they will say to you, well, but you control the House, you control the Senate, you control the White House. How come you weren't able to do that? And I'm sorry, there's no excuse that's going to make people say, oh, wow, now I get it. So that's, I hate to be that blunt, but the fact is, if Democrats don't govern, they are going to contribute mightily.
John, I am laughing because I was in a meeting today at a very high level of the US Senate, where I kind of made that point. People tell me how the bureaucracy is there, and you can't do it that way. And I did remind them that we do have the presidency, the Senate, and the House. But be that as it may, anyone else want to jump in?
Can I add one thing?
Yeah,
Senator.
Sure.
I was just going to say that we've lived this history before. Back at the beginning of the Jim Crow era, you had states like Mississippi change their constitution to disenfranchise Black voters through poll taxes or literacy tests. And there was an effort in the US Senate that would have blocked this. It was called the Lodge Bill of 1890 and 1891. And back then, Democrats were the insurrectionists and Republicans were the party of civil rights. And there were Republicans that wanted to pass federal legislation protecting voting rights that would have banned the poll taxes and the literacy tests in states like Mississippi. And they were blocked by segregationist Democrats, but also by a handful of Republicans that supported the filibuster and wanted to talk about things like the rights of silver instead of protecting voting rights. And no one remembers the Lodge Bill anymore because we had 70 years of Jim Crow following it. And it's the same way. No one's going to remember the Freedom to Vote Act if in 4, 8, 12 years, there's no more democracy left to protect. So it's not just that we're in a crisis ahead of us. We already have a roadmap of history of what happened when Congress doesn't protect voting rights.
We're focusing tonight on means by which states are engaged in voter suppression and gerrymandering. But Amy touched a little bit on the issue of dark money and money in politics. And I just want to mention something that the corporate media does not talk about very much right now. In terms of Build Back Better, there is an unprecedented, we're talking about many, many hundreds of millions of dollars coming in right now to lobbyists, campaign contributions, advertising all over this country, trying to stop us from lowering the cost of prescription drugs. Amy and I have been working on that. Pharmaceutical industry spending minimal $300 million. Private insurance companies spending huge amount of money to stop the expansion of Medicare to cover dental and hearing and vision. The wealthiest people in this country don't want to pay their fair share of taxes. Fossil fuel industry. So when you talk about delivering for the people, which was John was talking about, we can't ignore above voter suppression, above and beyond gerrymandering, the role that money plays in stopping us from doing what the American people want us to do. Anything more on that subject?
Just one thing on the money in politics, if I could. And we were just talking about gerrymandering. The state of Wisconsin, which we were talking about, has elected state Supreme Court justices. They're elected in supposedly nonpartisan elections. Over the last 20,000 years, millions of dollars in out-of-state money, some in-state, has flowed into our Supreme Court races. The conservatives, Republicans, have put an immense emphasis on electing Supreme Court justices. They have succeeded in securing a 4-3 majority, and it was that 4-3 majority yesterday that upheld Republican gerrymandering of Wisconsin. And so it's very easy to make this point that money in politics is what is going to cause, very possibly, unless we get a break from the federal courts, is very possibly going to cause Wisconsin to have radically gerrymandered maps that will undermine democracy for another decade. Money in politics did that.
And that takes us right to the very next question that we have, and that is from Kalik. And that is, how do we stop oligarchy and big money from buying elections under our current system? Thoughts on that one?
Well, I'll just start and say that the dark money groups are behind the voter suppression efforts. We often think about these things as separate, but in Mother Jones, we published a story earlier in the year showing a leaked video from a conference with the Heritage Foundation, one of the biggest dark money groups, where they bragged about how they had written what they called model legislation restricting voting rights in places like Georgia and Texas. And they said, we did it quietly and we did it quickly. Nobody even noticed. And they were actually bragging about how easy it was to make it harder to vote. And of course, these are the same groups that are then spending money to block the Freedom to Vote Act, which would crack down on dark money. So I think you're absolutely right, Senator Sanders. People often view these as two separate issues. And I think one reason why young people are so disillusioned by US politics is they feel like both parties are bought off, that both parties are corrupt.
Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody, Ari.
You made that point very eloquently in your runs, but I think that we need to view this as holistically, that if you make it easy to vote, but there's nobody to vote for, or people feel like outcomes are predetermined because of the amount of money in the system, people are still going to be disillusioned. That you have to solve the problem of democracy holistically. If you solve one problem, but you leave other avenues for corruption and manipulation, then people will remain disillusioned by the process.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one, money in politics?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen these guys do is when they saw that they lost the presidential, they lost Georgia, instead of trying to change their candidates, they're doubling down on that, or change their policies, they're trying to change the rules. And to do that, as pointed out by Ari, it takes money. And so obviously public finance is one answer. There's all the details of how we did this in this bill, but there's a democracy fund in this bill that can be used for that, which is really important.
Say a word on that, Amy. That's not unimportant. Say a word on that. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's for the House races, but it's an ability paid for, by the way, completely on people, white collar offenders and people breaking the law on the corporate side. And it allows states, if they want, and this was the negotiation, but it allows them to set up a public finance system on the federal level, like what we've seen in a state like Minnesota on the state level. So that is in the bill. And one other thing this is a bit off, but I want to think it's really important for people to know, given what we've seen and what was raised about Wisconsin and Georgia, is that they're trying to get rid of election boards as well, right? And so it's really important for everyone to know this, that in the bill, it sets a standard for that. Because again, Congress can make or alter federal elections. So it sets a standard for not doing that unless there's malfeasance. And also would be, when we talked about overturning the results, there's provisions in there for that as well. Because we've got to get at the newest with all this dark money going in, going back to Bernie's original question, it funds a lot of bad stuff. And we want to have federal standards. You got to be ready to get at them.
We have some examples of public funding around the country that are working pretty well, do we not? Are you familiar with those, or John? Or
New York City.
New York City, right? State of Maine, I think, does public funding for their elections.
Look, and the thing is that we had a lot of public funding in the United States, a lot of experiments with it, and a lot of places that ran it. Wisconsin, where I come from, had public funding, in the 70s into the 80s. It's how Russ Feingold got into politics and rose up as a guy who didn't have a lot of means. And so it existed. But the fact of the matter is that Senator Klobuchar just cited something that's really important. There is an assault on state elections boards and on the people who run nonpartisan elections across this country. And part of what they do is run elections. Part of what they historically did also was look at campaign finance to make sure that you didn't run campaigns that had dark money and all sorts of dirty money coming in. That has been under brutal assault. Again, I'll use the Wisconsin example. In the last month in the state of Wisconsin, Republican legislators have demanded that the head of the state elections board resign. They have talked about ways to undermine the state elections board. And Senator Ron Johnson has openly said that the legislature should just start overriding the elections board and tell counties and candidates what to do. And so this is where there is only a federal fix on this. We cannot imagine that the fix is going to come up from the states, because in this narrow window that we have, if there is not an answer that comes out of Washington that sets clear baseline standards, we are going to lose our ability to regulate money in politics to the extent that it exists. We are going to lose our ability to have free and fair elections to the extent that it exists. And the future really is dark without some federal intervention.
And it's not irrelevant to point out that Mitch McConnell was one of the great champions of Citizens United, because he understood the connection that if you have the unlimited ability of big money to buy elections, it will benefit him and his party. Any other thoughts on money in politics? Okay. Well, here's a very practical question. We've been talking about the need to fight to preserve American democracy, but here somebody's asking a very straightforward political question. That is voting rights reform a necessity to avoid a red wave in 2022 and 2024? In other words, and Amy and I have sat at meetings in the Senate, we've heard from different senators who basically said that if these Republican rules in state after state remain in effect, it will be impossible or extremely difficult for Democratic candidates to win. And so you got some thoughts about that in terms of Georgia, where you had two very, very close elections, three, throw in the presidential as well.
100%. And again, I flagged that we had overwhelming turnout, overwhelming participation. And the only reason that we got the results that we got is, again, because they were not able to suppress enough votes, right? And I think that a red wave is a mild way to describe what will happen if we aren't able to secure American elections. This is just, again, my truth telling here tonight. The Republican crime family, right, they are not interested in governing in this moment. I've listened to Senator Sanders and I've listened to Senator Klobuchar. I listened to John talk about the need to govern. We're literally talking about one party negotiating with themselves about how we protect American elections. We have essentially written off the Republican Party, and that we don't even invite them to the conversation because they have no interest in governing, that they are the party of no, and they are fine and content with being bad actors. But it's not just a political divide. This isn't just partisan bickering. This isn't just your garden variety Hatfield versus McCoy's, East Coast versus West Coast 90s rap beef. People are dying, right? That we are still in the middle of a pandemic, that there are decisions that need to be made. Republican governors like our own here in the state of Georgia, lying about what they knew, risking the lives of their citizens because of their ideology. And it's particularly egregious in the case of Georgia's governor because his office and his home are 5 miles from the CDC headquarters, right? So again, it's very important for us. I mean, I understand that we're talking about politics. We're here with but you're politicians, but you're more than that. You're servant leaders, right? And it's not just a red wave that is at risk. It is literally the lives of Americans and our futures.
One other thing along that line, Bernie, is that there are actually threats, real threats on election officials, right? And I mean, this is the Arizona Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs, outside her house, Katie, come out. Katie, come out. A Republican election official in Philadelphia, and they said, we'll hunt you down to her. A Republican election official in Philadelphia who's recently stepped down, his house, his kids put on the internet, threats to his life. we had a hearing on this in the Rules Committee with Republican and Democratic elected officials. And these threats are not just at election officials, but against everyone participating in this process are on the right. And one of the things this bill does, in addition to everything else, is making clear that that is a federal crime. And also making clear that we are protecting what the big lie does. And by this continual assault on elections, it actually creates more violence on its own against the very people that are trying to be the guardians of the democracy and count the votes.
They broke
I would just,
into the
go ahead and say.
Capitol. They broke into the United States Capitol.
Yep.
People died, right? That based off of the lie about our elections, based off of, this big lie as it's known now, right? What Confederate soldiers were not able to accomplish, right? January 6th assaulted our psyche, our elections, a plot to assassinate the vice president of the United States. This is not just garden variety Democrats versus Republican partisan bickering. It's something much, much more sinister, much, much more dangerous.
Yeah, I was just going to say, adding to what Nsé just said, that this should be viewed not as a threat to Democrats, but as a threat to democracy. And I think the biggest thing that we are at risk of losing here is the will of the people upon which the legitimacy in the democracy is conferred. Because you are in a situation now where in states like Wisconsin, states like Georgia, Democrats can win more votes, but Republicans are going to control way more power because of how the lines are drawn. That is fundamentally anti-democratic. You're in a situation now where officials could decide not to count votes if they don't like who people voted for. That is fundamentally anti-democratic. So one of my biggest critiques of fellow members of the media is when this issue is viewed as Democrats versus Republicans, when it's really Republicans versus democracy. And it's versus democracy as in the entire fabric of democracy. If we lose the will of the people being able to determine who's in power, if we lose the consent of the governed, we lose the entire legitimacy of our democracy. And I think that's why these threats of democracy right now are so grave, because it gets to the real core of, are we even still going to be a democracy if the will of the people is no longer operable?
Well, let me, Amy, throw a question. Let me throw a question to Amy if you'd like to answer it. You've worked hard on this issue for the last year. What kind of Republican interest has there been? I mean, NC makes the point that we're struggling with 50 votes and working that out.
Right.
With no
well, in the U.S. Senate, just nothing. And by the way, it didn't just start this year. Back when there were some Republicans working with me on backup paper ballots, I had a bill with Senator Langford and Burr and others shut down by the Trump White House, calls made to Republican senators shut down by Senator McConnell. So there's a long history of this where a legislation hasn't been allowed to advance. By the way, in the past, it was completely bipartisan. The Voting Rights Act, and let's put in a little pitch here for the John Lewis Act, which is also a very strong reform. And we had one Republican, Lisa Murkowski, Bernie, who did vote to allow the debate to continue on that bill. I think that's important to note. And then the other thing about it, besides just the Republican election officials, the Republican senators here shutting this down, out in the election world, there are Republican secretaries of state, there are Republican local election officials, and I think this is what Ari was getting at a bit, that this is an attack on democracy, who have been trying to do their jobs at great risk to themselves because they believe their jobs is to count the votes and to make sure we're still a democracy. So I wouldn't include every single Republican in this. I would talk about, for me, it is about the Congress and the Republicans in Congress who have shut down every single thing, even things that are strong in red states, even like the vote by mail in Utah. That's where they mostly vote by mail, in the state of Utah. Or the people returning citizens voting in a number of states, I think Montana, and a number of states where you have provisions that are actually supported Yet when it comes to Washington and they're looking how to win their own elections, they shut down every single attempt to allow people to vote.
All right, folks. I think you've heard from people who are not only knowledgeable, but are working day and night trying to save American democracy. And this is a pivotal moment. And it, you know, what people have said, it's not just Democrats and Republicans. It's whether or not we will continue to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, or whether we are going to have built-in majorities in state after state, which impacts clearly the Congress, state legislatures, whether we continue to maintain the ability of billionaires to buy elections, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an existential crisis. And I think in the midst of all this, when you throw in COVID, when you throw in climate, it is very easy for people to just throw up their hands and get discouraged. But we can't do that, because we're fighting not only for ourselves, we're fighting for our kids and our grandchildren, future. Don't forget that the struggle for democracy, you know, since the inception of this country has been a brutal one. People have died, people have suffered, and we cannot turn our backs on them. So the fight continues, the struggle continues, and I just want to thank all of you for watching and thank our great panel for being with us this evening. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Bernie.